Hey there, folks. Welcome to Yap Time with Alexandros. I am your host, Alex. I'm recording this episode live, so all the mistakes and flubs you hear, those are just part of the transcript. Like a lot of you, I go down internet rabbit holes a lot. I find weird things that I get kind of obsessed with, and I'm definitely the type of person where if I go down a rabbit hole on something, I definitely will like ride the train sometimes a little too far, right? I'll look all over the place and I'll try and learn more about this weird obsession I might have than is necessarily useful or good for me to do. And the thing that I have been fixating on recently is something very old and something that's pretty famous. You probably heard of it. You've probably seen it, in fact, in a specific way. And I'm talking, of course, about the most famous storage receptacle, the most famous storage box of all time. I'm talking about the Ark of the Covenant, that Ark of the Covenant, the one from the Bible, right? And from more famously the Indiana Jones films. And I got kind of obsessed with a specific question a few weeks ago, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But first off, I wanted to kind of start by just kind of giving a quick refresher for those of you who maybe didn't pay too much attention in Sunday school or whatever, right? So the Ark of the Covenant is a biblical artifact. It's something that is mentioned in the Old Testament, and it's basically it's a box. It's a storage container, and the Ark is built basically by the Israelites. Moses basically says, "Hey, go make this thing because God told me that you people should go make this thing." And the Ark is kind of a big rectangular box, and its purpose is to hold the Ten Commandments, the tablets that God gives to Moses, that gives the law to the people. And we'll talk about that a little bit, as well as some other kind of more odd and apocryphal things that the Ark has been said to hold over the year. But for those of you who maybe forgot, that's the Ark of the Covenant. And if you're thinking to yourself, what the heck is he talking about? I don't know what the heck this thing is. Everyone who has paid attention, if you've paid attention and seen big popular movies in the last 30 or 40 years, if you've seen the Indiana Jones films, you know what the Ark is, because the Ark is from the Indiana Jones film, right? The Raiders of the Lost Ark. That film, it's literally in the title of the film, right? The Lost Ark, referring to the Ark of the Covenant. And if you'll recall, in the Indiana Jones film, the Ark is kind of like the central sort of artifact that Indiana is trying to hunt, along with the Nazis and the Third Reich who also want it for nefarious purposes. And I remember seeing this film when I was a kid, and like a lot of people who see those kinds of movies when they're young, I was very traumatized by kind of that big famous climactic scene. Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, it's been decades since it came out, so too bad. I'm going to ruin it for you. But basically, the TLDR is that at the end of the film, they found the Ark of the Covenant, and the Nazis are in possession of it, and they sort of go out to somewhere in the desert, and they decide to open it. But of course, they can't just casually open it, right? They've got to dress up for it, and it's sort of this whole staged kind of a ritual, because of course it is. The Nazis love their pageantry as much as anyone does. And they open the box, and of course, right before they open their box, Indiana Jones is there along with his girlfriend, what's her name, Marion, and they're being held prisoner, right? They're literally tied to a stake in the ground. It's not a very eloquent solution, or way to restrain someone when you think about it. And Indiana Jones, he whispers over to Marion right before they open the box. He says, "Marion, close your eyes and keep them closed no matter what. Just don't look at it. Just avert your eyes." And it turns out that that's good advice that Indiana Jones has given her, because when the Nazis open the Ark, they open it, and one of the evil bad guys, he looks in and he's like, "Whoa!" He puts his hand and he's like, "Whoa! What's the big deal? It's just dust and sand. There's nothing in here." You're like, "Oh my God! How anticlimactic!" And then of course, whoa! Scary things start to happen. There's sort of this mysterious blue light inside of the Ark that starts glowing brighter and brighter, and as I recall, all of the power goes out and all the lights around them, right, or whatever. And then all hell breaks loose. Evil, supernatural, demonic, or angelic, whatever powers sort of shoot out of the Ark, and there's all of these energy beams. And of course, it destroys the Nazis, and it's shooting lightning through them, and it's just, oh my God, they're all the little thugs are getting killed, and the big bad guys they're standing in front of the Ark. And this is a very famous kind of a image. You've probably seen GIFs of it in memes and pop culture, which is that a couple of the guys, like, they're looking into the ark, the guys who are closest to it, and like what they see is like it's like staring into the face of God, and it's so bright and it's so intense that their faces literally melt. Like I don't mean like hypothetically like melt, like they literally like disintegrate in this like really bloody, gruesome spectacle. It still holds up pretty well, honestly. When you watch it, today, even this those sort of physical special effects from that era are still really charming, and still really like have the power to astound in their own way. If you're familiar with the Ark of the Covenant, it's probably from that film, and you've probably seen, either that specific scene or memes and clips from that scene in the past. And so I was thinking about it a few weeks ago, as I recall, and I got to wondering, like, okay, so like I know about the Ark of the Covenant from, this sort of silly pop culture point of view. But one thing I became sort of curious about was like, so the Ark was, at least in theory, a historical object, or it's referenced in scriptures, right? And so I thought I would talk a little bit about kind of some of the weirdness around that. Excuse me, sorry. As well as, well, for the sake of this episode, we're going to assume, we're going to assume that the Ark is a real physical historical object. There's no actual consensus on whether that's true or not. Most scholars, sorry to disappoint you all, most like modern scholars, people who study the Bible and sort of the biblical Middle East and all that, are very much like, well, it's referenced, and we know it's referenced a number of times in scriptures. There's no real archaeological evidence for it. We've never found it. We've never found any remnants of what we think it could be. It's a very apocryphal object, and understandably, many scholars have pointed out, that maybe what the Ark is really, in terms of like its historical veracity or its historical realness, is that this is actually more of a kind of like allegorical symbol, right? This is a divine symbol that comes up in the scriptures, which is never, and it was never meant to actually be considered a physical object at all. Anyway, we'll get all into that, but the point is, for the purpose of this podcast episode, let's suspend our disbelief. Let's forget about really like origins and stuff like that, and let's assume that somewhere out there, thousands of years ago, there was a physical object that approximately resembles kind of like the shape and size and dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant. And so let's start a little bit by talking about, well, what that might be like. So one thing that the first thing we have to know about the Ark is kind of like, well, what is this box? What is God's favorite box actually like made of, right? What exactly does it look like? And if you recall from the Indiana Jones films, they had apparently for the Indiana Jones films, they actually followed kind of the description of what the Ark is from scriptures. And in the Old Testament, the Ark is actually like described in like monotonous, like kind of exacting detail. And so that's kind of the first big thing that we'll sort of talk about. Let me just pull up my information here. So the Ark is described in Exodus, in the book of Exodus. What is it? Exodus chapter 25, verses 10 through 22. That kind of elaborates the dimensions of the Ark. The Ark is described as being 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubit wide, and approximately that high. Now, if you're not familiar, and I don't blame you if you're not, I wasn't either. A cubit is basically a biblical unit of measurement, and a cubit is about 1.5 feet. Right, that's the approximate length of a cubit. It's a unit of measure that we don't really necessarily use anymore, right? And to give you an idea in like modern numbers, and I'll use feet because I'm an American and we use feet, right? The Ark, the physical length of the Ark, if it was real, would be about 3.75 feet or 3 3/4 feet. The width of it would be about 2 1/4 feet, and the height would be about 2 1/4 feet. So those are the physical dimensions of it, right? That's the actual box itself. And of course, the box also has a lid, and the lid, of course, is very famous. The lid, in fact, has its own kind of apocryphal historical name. It's referred to as the mercy seat, and it's kind of got these two angels or cherubim, I think they're called, that are sort of like bent over, and they have their wings kind of pointed forward. If you've seen the Indiana Jones film, you know what I'm referring to. Now, let's talk about like what the Ark is actually made of, and again, we actually from the descriptions we know, The Ark is basically made of two, or really kind of three separate materials. The first thing it's made out of, predominantly, is wood. Contrary to like what to kind of how it's portrayed in the Indiana Jones films, or that kind of thing. The overwhelming majority of the Ark, if it was a real object, would be made of physical wood, and quite specifically, not just any type of wood. It would be made out of what was called acacia wood, which was a very prevalent tree in the biblical Middle East at that time. Acacia wood, I will say, is pretty heavy. I did a little research and a little digging around. The actual wood for the box itself alone, acacia wood is very dense. Given the dimensions described, just the physical wooden box itself would weigh about 260 to 270 pounds. It's pretty substantial, right? For a box that's about what, 3 by 2 by 2. But of course, we don't think of it typically as a wooden box, right? We think of it as being gold. Now, in the original kind of biblical kind of descriptions, the Ark of the Covenant is not gold through and through. That would make it impossible to move. It would be impossibly heavy, and of course, making things out of true solid gold at that size would be quite difficult at that time. And so, what what they basically would have done, again, if the Ark was a real object, is that acacia wooden box would basically be overlaid with a thin layer of gold. It would be thicker than what we think of as gold leaf, right? Which is something that you'll see sometimes in like medieval text, right? It would be thicker than that. And that layer of gold, even though it was very thin, gold is a very heavy metal. That thin layer of gold, if it coated a box of approximately those dimensions, that layer of gold would probably weigh anywhere between like 150 and 175 pounds, right? It's the numbers add up. This thing is freaking heavy, right? And finally, let's talk about the lid and the cherubim on the lid, right? Let's assume that the lid is described as being made as like solid gold, but for the sake of practicality, let's assume that there is kind of like a wooden base to the lid, and that the lid itself is mostly made of wood, which was overlaid with gold and stuff. The lid, if it was wood overlaid with gold, would probably weigh somewhere in the range of about 140 to 160 pounds. And that means that the total weight for the Ark of the Covenant, like the whole frickin' box itself, would have been anywhere between about 580 and 600 pounds. And if you're using the kilo system, that's about 265 kilograms. So she heavy, she big. And if you recall from the Indiana Jones films, the Ark is carried using poles that are basically inserted into rings in its side. It's literally like carried around by a whole team of people, right? And each of them kind of grabs one of the poles. So you have people on the right and people on the left, right? It's a big, heavy, cumbersome object. And the Indiana Jones film, they do a good job of portraying that, right? The Ark is this is a big, heavy, cumbersome thing to actually move around. Now, for the Indiana Jones film itself, surprise, surprise, they didn't actually build it out of gold. They built a number of kind of like mock-ups on it, or of it. And those mock-ups, I did some research. Those were mostly just built with like some fiberglass and I think some plaster, as well as kind of just like they basically just painted them gold or used some sort of like gold spray paint. I'm sure they had something like that back in the 80s. And they created a number of them for the film. And so, like I said, the Ark is a very big physical object. It's enormously cumbersome. And within it, you have contained, supposedly the original stone tablets that Moses brings down after he and God have their little talking to up on Sinai. Interestingly, there are like other stories that are, some of which are like also other places in the scripture, some of which are kind of like from more like rejected books of the Bible, or stories that are kind of like a little bit more apocryphal. In addition to, the Ark of the Covenant, there's also apparently some apocryphal stories stating that the first set of tablets, the one that like Moses, God gives to Moses and he brings down and he sees people worshiping the gold calf that they build, and Moses, throws a fit. He's like, fuck you people, and he shatters those stone tablets. Apparently, there are some like apocryphal stories that the Ark would have contained those things. In addition to that, there's also some apocryphal stories indicating that the Ark would have contained a jar of manna. Remember the manna that fell in the wilderness that was able to sustain the Israelites, when they were on their trek through the desert, right? God basically makes it rain this, nutritious sort of plant. But supposedly There was a golden jar of manna in there. And the final thing that the ark was said to contain, or the thing that was most considered, is the staff of Aaron that budded. Aaron, if you'll recall, is the like the brother of Moses, and I think sort of like the first sort of priest, so to speak, of like the biblical priestly tradition in the Judaic tradition. And supposedly Aaron's staff budded, or like buds and flowers came out of it, which is like a symbol of like, his like divine favor. The point being that, right, the Ark of the Covenant contains objects that, very much reinforce kind of the specialness of the Israelites, and the specialness and their relationship with the Abrahamic God, so to speak. Excuse me, sorry. And so, like I said, that's kind of like just sort of the contextual information about the Ark. And the Ark is one reason the Ark is like so fascinating is because it's mentioned and referenced a number of places throughout scriptures. And then following, oh gosh, sorry, I'm just looking at some information here, trying to dig this up. Following the Babylonian conquest of of Jerusalem back in the day, the Ark basically vanishes from the historical record. It's referenced and mentioned a number of times in the Bible, and it kind of goes on a big long journey from when the Israelites first create it to when it eventually comes to rest in the temple in Jerusalem under, I think it was like King David or King Solomon. I forget the one. Sorry, my knowledge of biblical history is a little limited. But basically, after the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem, and yeah, it was 586 BC. The Ark kind of just vanishes from the historical record, and so basically the sort of rumor mill and conspiracy theories around the Ark, they basically come about from kind of that moment onward. And there's different places have claimed to have the Ark at different times. Some of them still claim to. There is a church in Ethiopia, like the Church of I think it's referred to. Hold on, look it up here. I think it's referred to as like the Church of Saint Mary, somewhere in Oxum, Ethiopia. They apparently claim to have it, and that they have like a special little separate chapel where they keep it to this day, apparently. And it's guarded by the most powerful object in the universe, right? It's got these supernatural powers. It's guarded, they say, by literally a single monk, and it's literally just a single guy who ever has permission to like go in there and actually look at it. And that's the only guy, right? So the Ark is basically has a custodian, and it's just like this random old guy in a church in Ethiopia. That's sort of an apocryphal claim. Not surprisingly, modern historians and a lot of Ethiopian people were like, yeah, that's probably we're not sure we quite believe that, but that's what's claimed. There's also some claims, or been claims, that that following the Babylonian conquest, the Ark made its way to Mount Nebo, which I think is in modern Jordan, I believe. And there's, of course, other claims too. Some people insist that it's actually is still in Jerusalem, that it's actually beneath the Temple Mount, and the Wailing Wall and all that in the old city of Jerusalem. And there's also, of course, a lot of other historical claims, many of which, are mostly are not very well historically informed and get into things like some pretty woo-woo conspiracy theories. There's also a theory that the Ark would have been there's a conspiracy theory that claims that the Ark was basically discovered by the Knights Templar, which was a medieval Christian military order. The Knights Templar. If you've ever been in the world of conspiracy theories, how many times have you heard about the Knights Templar? Gosh, they're seemingly responsible for just everything, I guess. And the idea is that they discovered the Ark during the Crusades, and they hid it somewhere to protect its power. How convenient. There's no evidence for that. There's literally no historical evidence that connects the Knights Templar to the Ark. But the Templar are associated with an interest in ancient relics, and the idea that they're sort of the secret society over the centuries has kind of caused this, sort of mystique to develop around them, which dovetails really well with obviously a lot of conspiratorial thinking. There's also a theory that the Ark, that the Catholics have it, the Pope has it, and that the Ark was taken to Rome sometime after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 in the Common Era, and it's now hidden in, of course, the Vatican Secret Archives. And this is like another kind of conspiratorial catch-all, right? There are archives under the Vatican which contain many ancient artifacts, and there's been a long ongoing theory for centuries, most of which is built around the kind of like anti-papist and anti-Catholic sentiment that like, oh, the Catholics, they've been hoarding all the real important stuff, and that the Catholics have sort of been acting like the Christian CIA or the Catholic CIA, and they've been hiding the truth of the real religious history of the world from us just because they have a bunch of stuff stuffed into a climate-controlled basement somewhere. Again, there's no evidence that they have it. In fact, the Vatican has actually come out and publicly denied that they actually have it, which of course has only created more fodder for conspiracy theorists saying like, oh no, they must have it because who would actually just say they don't have something unless they didn't. But like I said, there's also there's conspiracies that it was that it's an ancient alien artifact. I'm not going to dignify that with a response. That's obviously nonsense. Interestingly, the other conspiracy theory, which is most prominent, is the one that you and I are probably familiar with, which is the idea that that the Ark was taken by the Nazis. Now, I will say, this is a great example of a conspiracy theory whose precise source we can actually trace. That idea derives entirely out of Steven Spielberg's Indiana Jones film, right? There is precisely no historical basis for that. It is a fabrication that Spielberg came up with. It was something that he came up with because, he was like, oh, well, Spielberg's like a smart guy. He's familiar with like, the idea from biblical history of the Ark. But yeah, that was purely a fabrication that was just sold to make a story, basically. And the idea behind it being like, oh, well, it is true that the Nazis were interested in occult artifacts. There is no demonstrable evidence anywhere that they ever found an Ark of the Covenant. And as far as I know, that they ever were even specifically looking for it. But it kind of dovetails with these sort of wacko ideas of kind of like Nazi occultism that we hear about from time to time. There's also people who believe that the Ark is controlled by a secret society, such as, of course, the Illuminati or the Freemasons, right? And who use its power to influence world events. I'm not sure how opening a box that God told someone to make that melted someone's face in an Indiana Jones film correlates to real global and political power, but that's something that people have said about it. And one of the more interesting theories, which is also unsatisfying, is what I call the Thanos theory, which was that the Ark was destroyed to hide its power. Right? They used the Ark to destroy the Ark. Right? He used the stones to destroy the stones. And again, there's no evidence to actually support that claim, but it reflects fears and dangers about the Ark and the power that it represents. I mean, really quick, I will kind of add a little aside to this. The stories about the Ark of the Covenant possessing supernatural powers, those are based on like two somewhat apocryphal biblical stories. One, which is that some guy who's accompanying the Ark accidentally touches it and just dies instantly, which is a story in the Old Testament. And the other one being, I think, that the Ark at one point is paraded around the city of Jericho for like 7 days, and presumably that's what causes the city, I think, like the city of Jericho to fall, right? And so because of that and those associations, the Ark has come to be viewed as being a supernatural object itself throughout history, or in popular culture, instead of being viewed as a symbol for kind of a bigger, more religious or spiritual kind of meaning, right? And that's kind of, that sort of tracks with like how we think of as like religious objects and symbols over time, right? We forget that the box itself is a sign of something else. It's a symbol that stands in for kind of a bigger idea of a covenant between the divine and human beings, right? Today, we think about the Ark as basically just being like a super-powered, supernatural nuclear weapon of some sort, right? You touch it, you mess with it, oh, kaboom, big, nasty, ugly things come out of it, and you get your face melted and blown up. Now, what I wanted to kind of get to, and this was really kind of the source of what led me down this like wacko rabbit hole that I went down the other week. What I became curious about was like, okay, again, let's assume that some physical box matching this description had been real in the biblical era, right? What most likely would have been its fate? And the answer to this actually is both more interesting but also more mundane than you might think. And so, like I said, the Ark basically disappears from any sort of like historical knowledge that we get from the scriptures in the year 586 after the Babylonian conquest. And there's probably the truth of it. There were a couple kind of like theories that have been proposed to this, and these aren't really conspiracy theories. These are more like scholars saying like, well, okay, let's assume this thing was real. Realistically, where would it be, right? Or what would have happened to this, object given what we know, about it. And the there are several scenarios, and I'll kind of elaborate what they were. The most uh, the most likely scenario is that the Ark would have been pillaged, stolen, and it would have been melted down. The gold on it would have been extraordinarily valuable because gold's always been valuable, and the Babylonians or possibly the Romans might have just simply looted the gold. They would have stripped it from the wooden box under it, and they would have simply melted it down into coins or ingots, which was a very, very common practice in antiquity, in ancient times, right? You find a gold object, gold, one reason gold is so valuable is because it's fairly easy to melt down and transport, right? It's easy to use it, fit it into a crucible, melt it down, scoop out some impurities, and then just, basically send it somewhere else. Another theory, again, assumes that it was real, is that if it was hidden, it could possibly still exist, but it would be in a very deteriorated state, and most likely not really there at all. And this was actually a little bit interesting to learn about. So, gold does tarnish over time, obviously, but it doesn't really break down. Acacia wood is wood, right? It's an organic compound. Over thousands of years, unless it was stored in an airtight environment where there was no like oxygen coming in really to affect it, the actual wooden frame for the Ark of the Covenant, the acacia would have broken down and would most likely have more or less be in the condition of being dust today, right? It would be in a radically deteriorated state, or maybe there would just be some fragments of it left. And that's the actual blunt reality, right? And again, let's say that actually had happened, right? And someone had, maybe many hundreds or thousands of years come across it in the subsequent times, right? They probably would have just found like some scraps of gold. They probably would have taken them, and again, they probably just would have melted them down because they would have immediately perceived that it was gold and it was valuable, and they would have taken it for themselves. Now, interestingly, and this is where I really dug into a rabbit hole, and I learned a little bit about goldsmithing in ancient times. The gold on the Ark, if it had been melted down, which I said was kind of like a common practice at those times, gold is obviously a very valuable commodity. And like I said, it was very common in ancient times for gold to be melted down and repurposed, right? Gold objects, and there are references in the Bible to this happening, right? When cities are sacked and basically the objects and the gold icons from other traditions were found, the conquerors would take that gold for themselves, and they would basically melt it down. And so I thought I would elaborate a little bit about what exactly would that look like. So for starters, and here's where we'll get into a little bit more technical detail that I found interesting. Ancient gold was not as pure as modern gold, right? It often contained significant amounts of silver, copper, and other trace metals. And when it was melted down, those sorts of impurities would, of course, separate from the gold, and they would form a layer of what's called slag, basically on top of the molten metal, and that would be basically scooped away. In ancient times, in antiquity, gold was typically melted in a big crucible over a fire. Like I said, the impurities would rise to the surface, and they would be skimmed off and discarded. But that process, especially in ancient times, was not perfect. Some gold would inevitably be lost with the slag. And the amount of gold that would be lost. So again, let's say hypothetically that the Ark of the Covenant had been found, and someone had just said, "Hey, the gold's mine," and they took the gold. And weren't blown up by supernatural powers by it, right? The amount of gold lost would depend on the skill of the refiner and kind of the initial purity of the gold in the covenant itself. Studies of ancient metallurgical sites suggest that anywhere between 5 and 20% of gold could be lost in the slag during refining, and we know that because archaeologists can perform analyses of like refining sites from ancient times, and they could look at the slag heap, and they could look at like how much gold was in kind of like left over in the traces of those slag heaps, for example, right? And that would give them an idea of like, well, given what percentage of gold there is here relative to all the other non-gold metals, this is kind of an estimate of how much gold we think they would have lost, right? And that way we use modern kind of scientific knowledge to infer things about the ancient past. So to give you an example, let's say that the gold that the Ark of the Covenant was coated in was 80% pure, which would have been a reasonable amount of purity back in those days. Melting that down would have resulted in a significant portion or could have resulted in anywhere between about 5 to 20% being skimmed off as slag. And obviously, after refining it, the remaining gold would have been pure and could be reused for other purposes. But the total amount of gold recovered would, of course, be substantially less than the original, excuse me, amount. And so what that basically tells us is that if the Ark of the Covenant had been a historical object and had been found, and the gold had been melted down, a lot of it would, where it would reside, basically, a lot of it, the mass of it, probably today would reside in slag heaps, basically, in heaps of metal at different refinery sites throughout kind of like the biblical Middle Eastern, part of the world. And so, like I said, the remaining gold would have been repurposed and used for other purposes. Excuse me. Let me just do a little bit more research here. And so, like I said, what we find basically is that it would have been melted down, as I said. Sorry, I'm repeating myself a little bit. Into ingots or coins. Gold objects, it's important to understand, are rarely discarded. Gold, no one throws gold away, right? Instead, they're usually melted down and reused when they fall out of fashion or damaged or they're captured. Someone steals them, right? And so there's a lot of gold in the world that has been melted down and repurposed and reforged again and again and again. If the Ark and the gold on it had been found and melted down, it probably would have been recycled countless times throughout history and probably passed through a number of civilizations. It would have started with the Babylonians. The Persians very well likely might have melted down some things that had trace pieces of it in it, as well as the Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantines, etc. And again, each time it was melted down, a smaller part of it would be lost in the slag heap. Interestingly, some of the gold, some of it from the Ark, again, if it was real and that had actually been what happened to it, had been melted down for gold, could still theoretically exist today. It would be impossible to trace its origins. It would be contained probably in modern gold, jewelry, or coins, or even electronics. Electronic components do contain little bits of gold. Gold is chemically stable; it doesn't degrade. And it can actually be recycled basically indefinitely without losing its kind of inherent properties. What gets lost, of course, is some of the mass of it with the loss of the diminishment of purity after it's purified. And it's really not until the modern times when we had like modern I forget the term, like not electrolysis, but like we have like kind of like modern chemical techniques that we have, which is what allows us to make gold like really, really refined and like really like 99% pure. They did not have the ability to do that in ancient times. They basically lacked the technology. But like I said, at any rate, those were all of those things, were kind of wacky things that I kind of like dove into and learned about. And I hadn't actually considered that like an object, from the ancient world traces of it could still survive today, but of course it would be dispersed all over the place, right? Maybe some of it is in a gold necklace, some of it's probably in an unrelated object in a museum somewhere. And like I said, the Ark is kind of one of those weird historical objects that has a lot of mystique. It's a religious symbol that is hugely potent, and is knowledge of it has kind of been around for forever. But ever since the Indiana Jones film, it's really kind of like popped back in, and you see it referenced in The Simpsons and in Uncharted, the video games, as well as like references to it in South Park and like some thriller novels and stuff. Even occasionally it'll pop up in like comic books. In fact, you could argue that like the National Treasure films, the Nicolas Cage films, and the Mummy franchise, all of those kind of franchises are kind of dependent on the Indiana Jones template, right? Which is finding mysterious, powerful old artifacts that man had better not mess around with, but which inevitably, man's hubris basically compels him to do. At any rate, like I said, that's kind of a rabbit hole that I've been digging into lately. Just like so, the Ark of the Covenant, if it had been a real historical object, well, what would that mean? What would it actually, and really like materially, where would it be today? And the answer, of course, is that realistically, it probably wouldn't be anywhere, which is to say the gold would have been melted down repeated numbers of times. And each time some of that gold would have been lost. And so the answer is most of it would probably just reside in slag heaps in archaeological sites from antiquity. and whatever traces of it might have survived as it was, repurposed into modern gold. There would be bits and pieces of it probably scattered all over the world. But that was sort of like a weird, headspace that I found myself wondering about, as I often do sometimes over the last couple of weeks. Maybe you found that interesting. I certainly did. I appreciate you all listening. And like I said, my name is Alex. This is Yapping with Alexandros, and I appreciate your time and hope you all have a pleasant day. Thank you.